Okay, Bruce, you can begin whenever you are ready.
Okay. Well, I want to welcome everybody. Nice to see you and thank you for joining us. This is our November 9th, 2020 speaker program for the World Affairs Council of Central Illinois. Now, this is the third program for our current business year, which runs from July 2020 through June 2021. My name is Bruce Strom, and I am the board president for the current business year. I know that some of you are not familiar with the World Affairs Council of Central Illinois. So I would like to review some things about it, just to give you a little bit of sense of who we are. The World Affairs Council of Central Illinois is also referred to by the acronym for its name, which happens to be WACCI, WACCI. It makes it easier to talk about things, although it has a peculiar sound to it. We like to think that we're not wacky. WACCI is a chapter of a national organization which is called the World Affairs Council of America. And our chapter was established in 1988. The mission of WACCI is to provide the residents in Central Illinois communities information about foreign policy issues and international relations, and to provide a forum for discussing these things. Its purpose also includes promoting and fostering international understanding of global issues. Now, WACCI receives support from NPR Illinois, which provides publicity for our programs. This provides residents in the area with information regarding WACCI programs, including the topic, the speaker, the date and time, and the location for each presentation. In addition, WACCI receives support from the University of Illinois at Springfield, from Lincoln Land Community College, and from Southern Illinois University School of Medicine. Tonight's program is presented in collaboration with the University of Illinois Springfield as part of its student program, which is referred to as ETCHI. That's an acronym which stands for Engaged Citizenship, Common Experience. WACCI recruits speakers for the ETCHI programs usually about twice each school year. We have automatically muted the microphone for each of you as you join tonight's Zoom program. For the duration of the speaker's presentation, we will ask that everyone please keep your microphone muted. After the speaker has finished her presentation, there will be a question and answer period, and we will explain the process for asking questions at that time. And now I would like to introduce Dr. Adriana Crocker, who is a member of the WACCI Program Committee. Dr. Crocker was our initial contact person for scheduling tonight's speaker, and she will introduce the speaker now. Dr. Crocker.
Hi, good evening. So I'm going to introduce Dr. Rachel Havrelock, who is the founder and director of the University of Illinois at Chicago UIC Freshwater Lab and co-creator of the Freshwater Stories digital platform. She's an associate professor of English at UIC and author of River Jordan, The Mythology of a Dividing Line, published by the University of Chicago Press, as well as the Joshua Generation, Israeli Occupation and the Bible, which was published by Princeton University Press just this year, 2020. Her current book project, Pipeline, How Oil Created the Modern Middle East and How Water Can Transform It, chronicles the role of oil extraction and infrastructure in the militarization of the Middle East and suggests how regional water management could transform the landscape. She conducted research in the United Kingdom, supported by a fellowship at the University of Cambridge, and in the Middle East on the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences Teen Research Award. She received an Alumni Impact Award from the US Department of State Global Fellows Program in June 2014. In addition to the Middle East, Dr. Havrelock's work addresses the Great Lakes here in the Midwest as a transborder water system, both abundant and imperiled. She holds grants from the Mott Foundation and the Humanities Without Walls Initiative funded by the Mellon Foundation. Welcome, Dr. Havrelock.
Thank you so much, Adriana. Thank you, Bruce. Thank you to WACI and my sister campus at the University of Illinois at Springfield. I'm very interested in Central Illinois and hope to have a chance to join you all there in person in the near future. So I am going to speak tonight to water crises and the actions and possibilities of water diplomacy in the Middle East. And if you will indulge me, I will share my screen and take us through a PowerPoint on the topic. Okay, hopefully nobody sees my Zoom controls, but only the slides. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. So we'll be speaking specifically tonight about water. So a few things about my thinking and my approach to water, and that changes our framework a bit. As I wrote here, we're taught to think about water as a geographic given, right? It's either there or it's not. It either floods or it doesn't. But when we think that water is simply this kind of objectively given geography, we don't attend to the social, political, and economic factors that produce the conditions of water scarcity or flooding or uneven distribution. And so when we think about water, we must at once think about infrastructure, because pipes and dams and irrigation systems end up creating environments and ultimately determining where water flows. And as we'll see tonight, there are a whole host of human and social decisions that determine whether safe water is easily accessible from public drinking fountains, or whether one must purchase it from a beverage corporation in a plastic container. Human decisions similarly determine whether a few tycoons end up controlling the desalination capacity of an entire country, or whether there are pricing scales that make water affordable to middle-class families or to the working poor. So with this frame, we start to see that lack of access to water doesn't always result from geographic scarcity or from technical incapacity, but often from how water services, utilities, are organized and managed, and how these kinds of water organizations can often deprive low-income groups of basic access to water and sanitation. Okay, so while we are categorizing water in this way, we also want to think about the connective power of water, because water flows across landscapes, it crosses boundaries. Oftentimes a single drop of water will interact with people that we ourselves will never meet. And as water flows, it interacts with multiple communities. And every community that comes into contact, say, with a given river has an impact on that river, right? Will the water become contaminated? Will it evaporate and remain part of the water cycle? Will it be diverted to the point that it is lost from the water table? And water also, and this reflects what I said in the earlier slide, it's often distributed in ways that reflect existing systems of wealth and power. And so from some very important studies that have been released in the past few years, and we can save this at the end if people are interested, the data has been collected to show that, for example, in the United States, water distribution follows lines of racial discrimination. Okay, so we're focusing here tonight on climate change as a threat multiplier in the Middle East and North Africa region, or MENA region. And so I'll explain a little bit what I mean about a threat multiplier, but we will be looking at some politically, economically, and resource challenge scenarios. And so from a study that came out of the UN and the World Bank, the title was given that climate change acts as a threat multiplier. So these threats can, of course, escalate and make things more tenuous, more dangerous, more untenable, or this study and studies like it can be a call to action to require a paradigm shift in diplomatic thinking. Okay, so here's my map, and let me just change my, okay, there we go. I'm going to change my zoom so I can see it and show it to you. So here we see in this green circle a map of the MENA region. And the areas in red on this map are those experiencing the greatest threats of water insecurity. Interestingly, some studies have shown that in particular in these water insecure areas are also where in the past 15 to 20 years, most of the weapons and bombs dropped in the world have also fallen. So one way to think about it, somewhat macabre, but rain is not falling in this region, yet bombs are. And when we turn to this map on the other side, we see the colors, right? The darker it is, the more numbers of people who have fallen in ongoing conflicts. And so, of course, right, the darkest colors we see in Nigeria, in Iraq, in Syria, also Libya, but Egypt and Yemen, Somalia, these are also all dark areas. So in looking at these two maps together, we start to think about climate change and the water insecurity that follows as threat multipliers. Okay, so the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change identified the MENA region as a climate change hotspot because of water scarcity, because of low levels of socio-ecological resilience, the ability to weather climate change, social tensions, and political conflicts, as well as an ongoing immigration crisis. And to stop for a moment on this question of immigration, another way to sort of frame the diplomatic dilemma is that does the global community want to think about provision and accessibility of resources for people in areas experiencing acute climate change? Or does the world community or diplomatic community want to think about procuring those resources when some of the same people are displaced and become climate refugees? So in other words, people need water. And there is absolutely no way around that fact. So part of the diplomatic question, and it's not been phrased as I've heard it quite so boldly, is that do you want to make sure people can receive water and sustain their livelihoods where they're living? Or does the world community want to think about making those provisions when people are migrants, climate refugees, or immigrants? Okay. So part of why there is such low socio-environmental resilience in the MENA region is because to date, very narrow security concerns have hindered progress in advancing a shared water security agenda. So in other words, competitions between states and among groups within states to date have hindered progress in making allocations and long-term plans about bodies of water and the water needs of large groups. So this fact means that with climate change, water scarcity threatens both national and regional stability. So on one side, I outline this. On the other, I provide a few suggestions about an alternate route. One, that states must realize the interconnected nature of their water security and that of their neighbors. So that is, if you divert a river to serve your own populace and that river loses one of its inputs, that water source as a whole becomes unstable. It's also very important, and this is true everywhere, not only for the MENA region, there needs to be an admission that there's no way where waste can be directed. So this admission really needs to motivate changes in industrial practices and diplomatic coordination. Disaster planning has to be regionally coordinated. And this is something I'll be speaking to as we go along, that the production of water should not be outsourced to the private sector. And I have a lot to say about this, but something that it is important to highlight is that the private sector wants larger markets. So thirsty people can be a very tantalizing market, but thirsty people in the socio-political sense is also a destabilizing factor. And finally, I suggest that the pollution of water sources must entail fines and in this way be prohibited. Okay. And there's a lot to say here, but I've put it in a chart to think about some of the indirect ways that climate change and social conflict have interacted to date. And so here, this really speaks directly to the MENA region. So we've got climate change in a region with pre-existing tensions, as well as low adaptive capacity. And then, right, that leads to negative impact on social economic development. That negative impact on development, as we've seen in places like Syria and Iraq, dissatisfaction with the government, frustration with the status quo of conflict, a lack of future perspective, as well as internal and cross-border migrations. And so here, these are factors that can destabilize a state or a society and can lead to demonstrations, uprisings, violent riots, radicalization, as well as a whole host of intergroup tensions and hostilities. This map here, I'm going to zoom in, if you'll allow me, out of the larger MENA region to focus in particular on the region of my own research, which is that of Israel, Palestine, and Jordan depicted here. And just as an aside, Dr. Crocker mentioned my work on pipelines. Just as we're passing, I will explain to you this sort of strange pan lid, if you will, of Jordan. Jordan is shaped like this, and the border between Syria and Jordan, this one here, was in fact determined because in the colonial era, as both the British Empire and France wanted to secure Iraqi oil for European markets, they did not want to share a pipeline in case Britain and France found themselves at odds in a future war. So this sort of strange line, as some have said, line in the sand, directly results from those sets of pipeline decisions in the early part of the 20th century. But we're talking about water, but I couldn't resist this detail. Okay, so what does it mean in thinking about Israel and Palestine and Jordan to consider projections about water insecurity? So here is a map from 2015, And you can see that the red represents the overdraft of water. Oh, excuse me. So in other words, this blue square right here represents the water supply, the existing water supply. And here in red is what is overdrawn, right? That water which is taken out of the system and is not renewable. Now you can see that the graph becomes all the more troubling when we look at that number basically doubling by 2030. But there's this other possibility here of meeting that shortfall through produced water. Now, we'll get to produced water in a moment, but there are two major forms of what we call produced water. So water that isn't provided by nature or precipitation, but rather in forms of water factories. One of those forms of produced water, which I am very interested in the Middle East and also for Illinois, we could talk about that after, is recycling water. So taking water that has been used in domestic settings, treating it so that it can be used in agriculture, industry, data cooling, and the like. So that's one form of produced water, recycled water. The second form of produced water, very popular throughout the MENA region, is desalination. Basically using a very large amount of energy to separate salt from seawater and to use that in order to produce drinking water. So this graph looks very bad about the future in the Middle East, but there's this other possibility. What role can produced water play in areas of water overdraft? And here, I'm going to introduce you a little bit to the work of an NGO with which I am involved, Eco-Peace Middle East. You can see here in the picture, this is a group of mayors from the Jordan River Valley meeting with mayors from the Great Lakes Basin, and this happened in 2015 on my campus at University of Illinois at Chicago. And so I'm not going to read this whole slide in the interest of time, but it provides a look at some of the challenges facing the Kingdom of Jordan as its population expands, both through natural causes as well as through the absorption of refugees, and its water sources dwindle. And again, back to this whole framework that I introduced in the beginning, right? We want to think again is that places didn't just end up water scarce, right? There's a whole set of political decisions and historical outcomes that cause this to be the case. In Jordan, the sort of water problem is not separable from the colonial legacy of privileging certain uses of water, like the oil industry, and ignoring others. What I'm showing you here is a very early agreement between a Zionist leader, Pinchas Rutenberg, and King Abdullah of Jordan. This first agreement between them was over water sharing. And the water sharing in question happened through this lake. Anyone who knows the region and says, I've never seen this lake, it's right, you never saw this lake, because this was an artificially flooded lake. The Jordan River, as well as the Yarmouk River, were diverted into this lake, and it generated hydroelectricity. So again, we see this colonial legacy of privileging hydroelectric power over other needs, but yet that premise that the Kingdom of Jordan and Zionist and later Israeli officials could agree over water led to the most durable peace treaty in the region. Here you see Yitzhak Rabin and King Hussein, who in the 1990s came up with a water swapping agreement. And here's the technology that substantiates that in this photo. Here again, these are pictures. This is Amman, Jordan, the biggest city in the kingdom. And here we are looking at the Zayatri refugee camp, filled with refugees from Syria in a desert area. I've been there. There is not a tree in sight. And the question of water procurement for this refugee camp is at crisis levels. Okay, I'm gonna keep moving through. So you see the point. This also, not the water scarcity, is not only a question about refugee populations, but also about resident populations. So here is a map of the Jordan Valley, known as the breadbasket of the region. But currently, this breadbasket, farmers face water shortages. The irrigation technologies are lacking, but profoundly, there are pockets in the agricultural Jordan Valley of 40% unemployment and up to 50% youth unemployment. So let's think back to that slide about ways in which climate change can exacerbate social and political tensions. Here's a look to the west of the Jordan about the existing natural water sources. A mountain aquifer that runs through the contested West Bank of Palestine, a coastal aquifer, which we'll speak about in a moment, and the Jordan River. A moment ago, I showed you a slide of crossing the Jordan and my work on that river. The Jordan River currently flows with 4% of its historic flow. And the only reason that there is a flow of the Jordan in the summer months, right, enough for Christian pilgrims to come and experience a baptism, the only reason that in its southern reaches there's any water in the Jordan is because of the direction of wastewater into the riverbed. Okay, so let me anticipate a little bit where this story is going, back to the possibility of water diplomacy. We haven't seen things progress very far on a nation-to-nation basis. And there are many reasons for that, which we can discuss. What I am presenting here before you is a map of something which exists. Thanks again to the EcoPeace Middle East Good Water Neighbors initiative. What Good Water Neighbors does is that they find communities who share a water source. And those communities can be Israeli-Jordanian, Israeli-Palestinian, Palestinian-Jordanian. And they bring together the mayors of these towns, the town councils, educators, youth, artists, and religious leaders. And they say, we share a water source. Now, in areas of conflict, and again, it used to seem farther from our own reality in the United States than it has lately. But in areas of conflict, people do not necessarily trust each other's science. And so science in the Good Water Neighbors program has to be collaborative so that the mayors will choose a scientist from their communities who will collaborate. And the scientific study happens with the political and cultural leaders at the same time. Once the science is established and agreed upon, a whole set of questions arise. How is water distributed? What are the major threats? What are the major sources of pollution? And over time, when trust builds, the next question becomes, what can we do together? And there have been many profound things that have emerged from this, including a water train from an Israeli community to its Palestinian good water neighbor in Gaza. When that community was under siege, the Israeli community made sure to get water across the border to them. This cluster of cities that you see up here, through their shared study, realized that untreated sewage posed the most profound threat to their shared water. So they raised the capital together as a consortium of towns, and they built a wastewater treatment plant. And so this, possibility of connecting with people around a watershed rather than as antagonists across a border can have a profound effect on the way people perceive the region and interact. Okay, I'm going to move through this. It's a little bit once upon a time, although we're still trying to do it. For quite a while, we were moving forward on a peace park at the Jordan River that could be entered from different sides, but I'll save this for the end, especially because the idea was that ecotourism would be an economic engine, and we are obviously not in a moment of a lot of tourism. Okay. So the other reason why these kinds of regional connections are so profound is that water distribution to date in the Middle East has occurred on the premise of national competition. Here you see Israel's national water carrier, finished in the 1960s, that brought water from the Sea of Galilee across the country in order to allow Jewish communities in the country to flourish. So this was a diversionary tactic meant to reinforce one community and to make sure that it would have control and sovereignty over water infrastructure. Okay, so here I say, in the end, water power depends on pipes and canals. Okay. You see, these maps show us again that when we're speaking about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, there are basically three bodies of water at issue: the Jordan River, the mountain aquifer, and the coastal aquifer, all of them disputed. And all of them currently at risk of being overdrawn, polluted, or even, as we will see in a moment, of collapse. Now, along with my slide that water power depends upon pipes and canals, water power has also depended on diplomacy to date. So in fact, as I said before, the most durable of Israel's peace treaty is the peace treaty with Jordan. It is by all estimations a very cold peace that, were there not a water swap agreement, would probably completely collapse. In the 1990s, when there was the diplomatic will for a two-state solution between Israel and Palestine, water was at issue. And there was a 1995 Oslo II interim agreement. The problem is that the Oslo agreement never addressed the power imbalance created when one of the parties controls the infrastructure of water. So for example, the Oslo II interim agreement granted Israelis over 71% of the mountain aquifer and Palestinians 17. Today, that ratio has changed from 87% allocation to Israelis and 13% to Palestinians. And here, we can elaborate afterward, are some of the statistics that show why the Oslo agreements, when it came to water, have basically failed. Okay, I'm going to keep going, and I'm going to arrive here. Now, some people, right, with certain ideas of diplomacy might say, well, if Israel is the stronger country and the Palestinians are water poor to the point of not being able to sustain farms or even daily life, right, at least one school of diplomacy that we've heard from recently would say, well, that's their problem. I am not going to right now dwell on the humanitarian issue, although we certainly can, but let me speak for a moment to the practical reality. The lion's share of Israel's drinking water at present is water that is produced at desalination plants. Remember, a lot of energy is poured on seawater in order to produce drinking water. So here is the Gaza Strip, where 2 million people live in a permanent state of siege, and where in 2018, the UN deemed that 97% of the water in the Gaza Strip was unfit for human consumption. 2020 was the UN's predicted year that the coastal aquifer that runs beneath Gaza and sustains those Palestinian communities would collapse. And 2020, as we all know, has been some year. So the coastal aquifer collapsed without much fanfare. Again, leaving 2 million people without a steady supply of basic drinking water. Okay, well, again, as we've heard from the State Department of late, that's the Palestinians' own problem, except that part of the collapse of the aquifer means that untreated sewage pours into the Mediterranean Sea. In fact, right, in Gaza, about 100 to 110 million liters of sewage flow daily into the Mediterranean Sea. Here it is depicted. About 15 miles, right, from the northern Gaza Strip is the Israeli city of Ashkelon, which was Israel's first desalination plant. So this means that the collapsed aquifer, right, not only has spoiled the natural water, but now raw untreated sewage pours in to the Israeli supply. Again, this is a picture kind of dramatizing how aquifer collapse occurs. And here we see a satellite, like an infrared picture, right? The red is untreated sewage, and here is a letter from Israeli communities just north of Gaza, begging the Israeli national government to please take into account the lack of basic water and sanitation in Gaza. So again, you see out of this good water neighbor scenario that you can even have a voice to speak up to the national government about these things. Okay, remember how about 15 miles between Gaza and the Ashkelon desalination plant, here receiving its award for the best desalination plant in the world. And this map shows the 6 projected, they're not all built yet, the 6 projected desalination plants in Israel. There are plans for expansion. And what I want to say, again, pointing to another current failure of the status quo, is not only is there aquifer collapse, not only is there untreated sewage pouring into the Mediterranean, right, despoiling the desalination water supply, but the other failure, as I see it, is that most of the desalination capacity in Israel is owned by 2 men, 2 oligarchs. It's an Israeli word, not mine. So 2 private investors are now running the water supply. And while there are plenty of plans of expansion, there are no approved plans to supply desalinated water, for example, to the people of Gaza. And the kind of irony about power in the pipe is that the national water carrier has been reversed. So where once water from the Sea of Galilee would come down to communities, now desalinated water moves through the same piping structures and is piped north. So the pipes change directions, but I'm not sure that the power dynamic changed, other than putting much more power in the hands of 2 investors. And I give this slide here. In the past year, there have been 2 agreements between Israel and Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates. This is from yesterday's newspaper. And I see from a diplomatic point of view a few fundamental flaws in these agreements. These agreements basically bring together entrepreneurs and private equity. And their goal, right, is to invest in each other's projects and make profits. And of course, I do not have anything against profits or business collaboration across borders. But what happens in both the Gulf and also in Israel is that these types of deals often put private individuals in charge of utilities and procurement of necessary everyday things like water and foodstuffs and housing, and they do nothing to address the acceleration of climate change and the destabilization to large parts of the populace. So although, right, an agreement from a diplomatic point of view is always a good thing, I think my prediction is out of these agreements is going to come more harm to the greater region ultimately than good. Okay, and here I'm going to go through this very quickly, but these are just photos to show the contrast between the Palestinian experience of water, the Israeli experience of water. Again, I'll move through them quickly. Okay, we'll come to the recommendations. But I don't want to end only with bad predictions, and it's also not the nature of my talk, which is ultimately about water diplomacy. And I would like to present to you the sort of newest idea in water diplomacy that looks at the post-World War II coal and steel agreement and the way in which that brought antagonists in World War II together to really think about production, procurement, and the sharing of materials. So this post-coal and steel agreement, and it wasn't a peace agreement, right? It was a resource agreement. And so we have, after studying that agreement, we put a proposal together that would be a similar kind of agreement in order to share resources, weather climate change, and try to, through healthy interdependence, de-escalate some of the rising tensions in the region. There are basically three elements to this water energy swap. And the first one would be desalination would continue in Israel. I would like it to be remunicipalized, but it's a harder sell. And desalination plants would also be built in Gaza. Those desalination plants would come with new pipes built that would serve communities in Palestine as well as in Jordan, supplying them with the necessary water for personal and economic survival. Well, Jordan doesn't have a lot of water, but it does have some of the ideal conditions for solar generation, renewable energy. And desalination, as I mentioned earlier, is extremely energy intensive. So the idea would be not simply some kind of humanitarian water supply to Palestine and Jordan, but also, right, an exchange of solar renewable energy to Israel, which could be used on the grid, and it also could be used to offset the carbon footprint of desalination. So, and Israel also, as you can see here, doesn't have a lot of space to do wide scale solar generation. So the idea here is that there would be both water and energy that would be distributed across borders, solving quite a few of the problems that we see here. Now, part of what's involved here and part of why this isn't just business, but is also diplomacy, is remember that the Jordan River, the mountain aquifer, and the coastal aquifer are all both contested bodies of water and overdrawn ones. So part of what the exchange of produced water and desalination could achieve would be shared agreements to protect the viability of these water sources and some honest dividing of the extant water sources among the parties that took seriously the rights of all of the riparian countries. And here I will end the formal part of the presentation with this outline that speaks to some of the geopolitical ramifications that we have concluded could come out of this kind of cross-border sharing of resources under conditions of accelerated climate change. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Havrelock. We really appreciate that you made time this evening to share your knowledge and research with us. I know I'm a big map person, so I really enjoyed the visuals that you had. So we now enter the Q&A portion of the evening. We have about 15-20 minutes for the discussion. And as in our past wacky events, we will use the raise hand function in Zoom to facilitate the Q&A. So to do so, you will click on the participants tab at the bottom of your screen. And then you will see an image of all of the participants. Next to your name, you will see the raise hand button. So if you have a question, please click to raise your hand. Dr. Adriana Crocker will be moderating the discussion this evening. And once Dr. Crocker has called your name, you may unmute yourself and ask your question. Please only one question at a time. And once your question has been answered, please mute yourself again and we will move on to the next person. So now please use the raise hand function if you have a question for Dr. Havrelock. And if you are unable to use the raise, oh, I see that we have a couple up now. I was going to say we may be able to use the chat function, but Rachel, I'll let you, or I'm sorry, Dr. Crocker.
Yes, Maureen. Hi, how are you? You can unmute yourself and ask the question.
Yes. Hello, everybody. When I was in Egypt a couple of years ago, they were talking about, on our way to the Valley of the Kings, they were talking about bringing back the flowering of the desert. And they were quite proud of the fact that the desert was blooming again. And I know that Israel has also been proud of the desert flowering again. And I'm wondering, how does that come about? And is there any way to have the desert flower without manipulating water in such a way that it's going to hurt somebody else?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. I'm going back to the national water carrier. Excuse my clicking. I mean, really, making the desert bloom, as Maureen said, was a kind of a key 1950s and 1960s aspiration, primarily by Israel's first Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion. But the idea took hold among his antagonists in neighboring countries. And the truth of the matter is that the desert shouldn't bloom. It's probably just as true for California's Central Valley as it is for Middle Eastern countries. And, you know, the pipes, I didn't go deep into the pipes, but this national water carrier had installations here in the southern desert. So making the desert bloom was an infrastructure and energy heavy endeavor to take water from the north and move it to the south The reason Ben-Gurion got this idea in his head is that the geography that was an outcome of Israel's 1948 war was that this, right, in 1948, this West Bank was conquered by the Kingdom of Jordan. So Israel ended up with this shape. And the way in which they dealt with this shape was by moving water. So deserts shouldn't bloom. Deserts do all kinds of remarkable things, and there are desert plants and desert ecosystems, and those are just as valuable as river valleys in their own way. So it wasn't a good idea. It was a waste of a lot of water, and you have things that are still going on in the Middle East right now, which is fields and farms of like banana trees, which is a highly water intensive crop, and they're grown for export. And the name of this in the water community, we call this virtual water, because if you export a banana or a watch or anything, you're also exporting the water of your area and your country out of your country. So this making the desert bloom also gave rise to the idea of agriculture for export economically. And that, agricultural story, both in Israel and in Jordan, plays a role in the depletion of the water sources. So, right, everyone needs to eat. This isn't about food security, it's about questions of export. And I would say that no, the desert shouldn't bloom. But if the desert is going to bloom, then it really should only bloom with water that is recycled and not water that is extracted from aquifers and from rivers.
Thank you. Sue, Massey?
Yes, I have a question about how much of this information that you've researched and ideas that you've calculated might be going into international diplomacy now to help create peace in the region.
Yeah, we work hard. EcoPeace works really, really hard in these diplomatic efforts. And as you could probably see from some of the slides, there's very tuned in ears in some global institutions like the UN, even the World Bank, because they're aware of that slide that I showed you about the destabilizing potential. I mean, it's not a potential anymore. I mean, there's been a verified study that drought and diversion of water played a central role in the Syrian uprising and the subsequent refugee crisis. So it's not the stuff of probability or possibility anymore. It's sort of the stuff of the present. And so this kind of water diplomacy appeals, especially to European foundations and think tanks and sort of to the UN and the World Bank. It has, there used to be quite an ear in the US State Department, right? I myself went on a water mission with the US State Department in the summer of 2011, I want to say, 2012. So water diplomacy was developing in the State Department. It's not been the case for the past 4 years. If anything, many existing efforts to provide and procure water for Palestinian towns and cities, that funding's been cut in the last 4 years. So it's not as if we didn't present it. I'm forgetting the name of the ambassador to Israel at present. We did present it and we did make the arguments, especially about the collapse of the aquifer in Gaza. with the question, how long do you think 2 million people without a viable source of water can stay where they are? It hasn't gone anywhere. Obviously, some new doors open right now, and it's both harder and easier in the region itself. It's really easy in small, not really easy, but it can be done in small rooms to start moving these things forward, but it gets very hard once it goes up through the national governments. So we found it's why it's really important to say, work with these consortiums of mayors or even business people. As you heard me say, I don't think that's the solution, but the idea is to kind of try to get these partners that are not in federal government so that they might turn to their governments and push it forward. So, these ideas are circulating, but obviously circulating is not enough. It is implementation, which is vital.
Thank you. I hope things get better in the future.
Thanks.
I saw somebody raising their hand a minute ago.
I think it's Rich, is that right?
Yeah, it's Rich Burning.
Okay. Okay.
In 2011, my wife and I were in Israel, and the use of gray water was being used then for agricultural purposes. We saw some great use of hydroponic systems as well as agricultural drip technology. And yes, we saw some great vegetables being grown as well as fruit and for export. And part of the reason was because it was top notch and it was an economic benefit to the area. I have to say, I don't believe I saw any real wasted water. Water was extremely valuable as a commodity, and I was impressed with that. Granted, I'm familiar with what's the word I want to say, direction of water into other areas. As you probably know, in Chicago, we reversed the river into Lake Michigan, from Lake Michigan. So this has been done over and over for one reason or another, mostly what you'd say the power structure of the time. So I think what I have an interest in, I guess, is why could not the government, and it's part of the diplomacy, I guess you're talking about, coming together and having the benefits of what you have just laid out. I'm not sure who has to be the catalyst for that. Can you go into what you're thinking on?
Yeah. Thanks for that question. And actually, you really got it right. I'm actually doing a big project now about rethinking the reversal of the Chicago River and thinking, instead of wasting it as we do and sending it down into the Illinois and Mississippi rivers and into the Gulf of Mexico, actually thinking about recycling the water. And you're absolutely right. Of course, how do I know about water recycling? I know about that from Israel. So you're absolutely right. I mean, Israeli water tech has been really smart. And it was smart because, the government was embattled, right? Obviously, there's, that is a contentious decision, what verb someone uses, but felt embattled. And so came up with the impossible, right? Reversing the flow of water, desalination through reverse osmosis, water recycling, drip irrigation. Now they're doing precision agriculture, right? Where just the amount of water and minerals that a plant needs is applied. So the tech is smart, but I'm afraid the policy is not. So back to the desalination question. I mean, let me get to the map of the desal plants. Where did it go? I'm quite concerned because, two guys, mega rich oligarchs, own all the desalination supply. And so they got the contracts by artificially lowering the price. Now, what happens when their concession with the government runs out and they can charge whatever they want for water and they say, let the market decide, right? So then what happens when the cost of water is beyond the potential of your average family and you've got all this internal displacement? So it's the privatized piece worries me a lot. Even what we've seen with water privatization in our own state and our own region, that can often lead to crises. And in fact, it's not only hypothetical, I don't even need to go locally. I've got the slide here that the biggest desalination plant that serves the Tel Aviv metro area, actually the summer of 2019, when I was last there, basically had a major chloride outbreak. And it was, there are some major public health risks, and they're a company, they're not a utility, so they suppressed it. And, I myself was drinking water away at that desalination plant and from it. So, when you outsource your basic needs to private equity, anything can happen. You lose the oversight over pricing, over access, over public health. So that's one place where the tech is good, but the ownership could get into a lot of problems. But my other critique here, why the tech is not enough, without proper diplomacy, is it's back to this map. I mean, how can you run, these great factories of fantastic tech and let an aquifer collapse and not address the wastewater? So I think, the tech alone is not enough. Tech without policy, tech without diplomacy, tech without oversight. It's not the silver bullet that tech developers like to say that it is. So what's missing? I mean, what my partners in the Middle East say is that what's missing is, a little push from the United States. In the end, the United States foots most of the bill for Israel's military. And so if you've got, a major country that is your donor and you've got really good tech, then things have to be pushed in a direction where the good tech works with policy, works with diplomacy, works on the ground, so that we get something like a desalination supply to Palestine and to Jordan in exchange for a solar market. So that's what the people in the Middle East say is missing, is a little push from the benefactor country. Or maybe a big push.
Yeah, and I see most everything what you agreed to or what you stated. I've spent a career both in the private and the public sector, and I assure you that all decisions on the public sector aren't always in the right direction.
For sure. Also true, right? Everyone needs a little oversight. Thank you. Yep.
Anybody else? Rachel, how has your work transferring to the Great Lakes what have you been doing?
Yeah, so I really, again, this environmental peace building, there's not quite a college or graduate school program one can do. So the Jordan River was my dissertation topic and the topic of my first book way back when. And I spent about 10 years conducting the field work. And so I came into the environmental peace building as a part of that field work. And like I said, it was a scale that I saw is quite possible, right? It's a smaller scale, but it's the scale at which I feel I have experienced that one can transcend various kinds of ethnic, religious, even partisan divides, because everybody needs to drink water. And when people think about it, when they come to consider their source of water and its health or lack thereof, and what that means for their children and what that means for their assets and investments, people take on a very practical attitude. And so it doesn't mean it makes everything go away, right? It doesn't dispel all of identity, but it's a very workable scale. So when I decided to sort of see if these ideas could apply where I live and where I'm from, I think the same thing. I think it more after the past 4 years. I think we all spent last week, or many of us spent last week, watching counties on television and hearing about the divide and the divide and the divide. Well, again, I'm a Great Lakes person, born and raised, and I know that those of us, whether it's up here in the lakes or the rivers, we love these places. They also make us who we are, as well as ethnicity and religion and political party and the like. And we happen to be, in our part of the world, it doesn't look like the MENA region, right? We are a watery part of the world. Again, our climate change issue is flooding and too much precipitation, but we really have a chance in our so-called Rust Belt. We really have a chance to survive and thrive in climate change by thinking about food and beverage, thinking about water filtration, thinking about plumbing and distribution, thinking about remediation, thinking about recycling and supply to other parts of the city and the world. So, but I think the main thing is, like, you really can work on the watershed level. Because when you gather with people and you think, what's the projection? What are we going to be looking at in the next 5 to 10 years, 50 years, 100 years? And you start to think about what's possible, and you start to think about, what's viable, where money can be made and things can be developed. It's very powerful. And I think, again, like I said, I live on a Great Lake. I'm from another one. So it's not like I didn't know there were plenty of divides here as well. But I think that at this time of really thinking about moving forward and confronting climate change and how important this part of the world clearly is to the outcome of national elections, I think we, have to ask for more in terms of improving our infrastructure and dealing with erosion and fluctuation and contamination. So we have to ask for more and, throw our weight a little bit around. But two, we've got to think together. And I think the scale of the watershed really in our era, in both of these parts of the world, is the operative one. So so a lot of those lessons I ended up bringing home. And as I said, as Rich said, of course, it's not just the national water carrier. Chicago has this whole canal, but we are wasting so much water in one part of the state, while other parts of the state, the Illinois State Water Survey says 15 years, the aquifers in some parts of Illinois will go dry. So it's like, we got to think that one through. That's a radical form of water unevenness that I think we could do, the right tech and the right policy. And we might even be able to heal some of the divides within our own state.
Thank you. Excellent. I have here a message from Betsy She's asking, could there be a role for NGOs to achieving a solution to the water challenge in the MENA region?
I mean, I think, you know, I'm speaking, of course, as a researcher, but as you can see, you know, my research on eco-peace also turned into learning from eco-peace and working with eco-peace. And so, you know, this model comes out of NGO thinking. And I think, you know, the power of NGOs is tremendous because, you know, NGOs have outlets in other parts of the world, have influence, can bring investors, or can, you know, produce the policy. So I think it's a very, very important scale. And the other thing that NGOs, you know, can do is to, you know, work with communities that might share a watershed, but have, you know, but do not have allies and their respective governments to work together. So I think that the NGO scale is really vital. I was, for example, part of a project some years ago that was all about amplifying the religious significance of the Jordan River, you know, to monotheistic religions, and really thinking about, you know, with so much tourism and at the time, you know, so many pilgrimages to the region, you know, we thought about even how people go to the Jordan River and sometimes they buy that little bottle. And what if instead, you know, they bought like some kind of, you know, like certificate, like I'm adding to the Jordan, not taking away. So I think there's, because of the significance of the region in geopolitical, but also historical and religious terms, I think there's a big role, like necessary, for the NGOs to kind of build the partnerships, do the work, do some of the fundraising and some of the media to, you know, open up space for these things to happen.
Excellent. We have one last question. Lynn Freite.
Yes, thank you. I'm just stuck on the 1 to 2 million people in Gaza that don't have a sustainable, reliable water source. And I don't want to be a downer, and I know you can't answer, where would these people go if the world doesn't do something? So in my mind, it's like, are they going to die? Because who's going to accept 1 million to 2 million people at this point? So I don't know if you have any comments on that. That's where I'm stuck. Like, they don't have a reliable water source now, and there isn't an immediate solution, like as far as diplomacy, policy. The tech is there maybe, but the other things aren't. So I'm just kind of really sad.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's right? I mean, there's a humanitarian aspect here of 2 million people without viable water,
Right.
and it's collapsed. And I mean, anywhere from 25 to 40% of the illnesses in the region are waterborne. And again, remember, like, COVID is happening all over the world, and what we've got until we've got something else is washing your hands. So I don't think you're wrong to be stuck on that, because there's different scenarios, right? There's a real nightmare scenario where, well, I mean, I think it already is a nightmare for the people who live in Gaza. Like, let me be frank. I think it is a nightmare, especially for young people. But, you know, the other nightmare solution is it's not viable, and, you know, there's fencing, but 2 million people are a lot of people. And what if they charge the fence? And what if it, you know, really was a kind of a hand-to-hand combat of person to person? That's a very dark scenario as well. It's also very dark to see, to imagine just the possibility of people suffering and being abandoned not only from the world, by the world, but also Israel and Egypt that keep Gaza under siege. But okay, I mean, there's a lot of impossibility to it, but it's also not totally impossible because there is an existing pipe of water supply that hasn't been opened. It is, I mean, the Israeli desalination plants are, because it's run on market principles, right? They're run, they never stop, right? They're not like, oh, we have enough water, stop. They're always running. And so, there's the possibility, say, of development aid to purchase the water at some kind of, I mean, again, the water price would have to be worked out and there's a lot there, but a pipe exists. And the closest desalination plant is 15 miles. So it's technically not that hard to open a pipe to Gaza and lay some pipe and do that. It's also not impossible to meet the energy needs to run wastewater treatment. I didn't get to this part, but the Eastern Mediterranean is now having a natural gas boom. And Chevron just bought shares. And so, all along this area by Turkey, by Greece, by Lebanon, by Israel, I mean, it could exacerbate quite a few tensions. But Shell Oil's in the game, Chevron's in the game. They're producing massive amounts of natural gas in the Eastern Mediterranean, right here, offshore. So you could also run lines to Gaza for the necessary energy to run a desalination plant, say, to run wastewater treatment, to do recycling. So the resources are there and some of the basic infrastructure is there. The will is not there, but, there are agencies, global, national, the US State Department, if it decided to, could simply say, you've got to supply water and energy to Gaza. And EcoPeace has been making this argument to the Israeli government using the language of security. What do you think is going to happen when 2 million people increasingly, have literally no water? So I think you're right to be sad. It's a haunting thing. And, I just think, I mean, God, 2020 became so overwhelming. But even before it did, when 2020 came, I thought, all right, some big magazine is going to say, like, aquifer collapses. But it completely, like, even before COVID and everything else, it just didn't make the news. And I think we need to know it for the people. But to me, it's also a warning sign that certain kinds of policies can lead to collapsed aquifers. Again, it's both far and close. Something very similar aquifer collapse is also projected for Joliet, Illinois. So I feel like all that we're not hearing about aquifer collapse, although understandably we're all a bit overwhelmed. I think if we don't pay attention to the harbingers, it's an error at every level. But it's not impossible. The pipe exists, and now the gas exists, and it's all really close. So these things just have to be opened up. And again, like whether it's business or policy or diplomacy or probably all at once, there just has to be a breakthrough on this or everybody pays the price.
Thank you so much. I think we have another question, but Jolene, time is Jolene here?
We can do one more question if you'd like.
Okay, then it's Natalie Silverman. She's asking, what is the government of Gaza doing to provide water to its citizens?
Yeah, so the government of Gaza is pretty hamstrung So there's this whole story, I tell it in my book, about the Engest wastewater treatment plant. Let me get to the right map. I'll show this to you. So, yeah, okay, here it is. So this Beit Lahia is the site in northern Gaza of a wastewater treatment plant. You'll have to excuse me that I don't remember the year that this happens at present, but it was in the 20 teens. So basically, like the Beit Lahia wastewater treatment plant itself collapsed, and the nearby town was literally like inundated by untreated wastewater. A person even lost his life. And so then, right, this came offline. So then, and this one was NGO work to get this Engest, so to rebuild the Beit Lahia wastewater treatment plant. So again, it was the NGOs really advocated for it, and the World Bank came to finance it. But then because Israel has a principle of not supplying construction materials to Gaza, because of their dual use. So anything that could be used in munitions or armaments, Israel won't supply to Gaza. So it was a whole story of getting the concrete to Gaza to build the Engest plant. It is up and running. It's curbed a little bit of that wastewater, but already, like the loan, so it was a loan from the World Bank and European countries, and they expected it to be up and running, and then to generate revenue because people would pay for a wastewater treatment plant. But the whole thing took so long that it got over leveraged and more expensive, and the loans are coming due. And, the government of Gaza doesn't have money. And often when they receive money from their allies in the Gulf or Iran, that money doesn't come like here to run your society. That's also money to keep fighting a war. So, the European countries provided loans, but they want their payment. The aid that comes from different Muslim states, isn't aid like keep your people nourished and drinking water. It's more keep your people at war with Israel. So the Engest plant, like the money is due, they don't have any. Its future is really, really uncertain. So yeah, the government of Gaza is in an impossible situation, but also the people that rise to the top of that government do so because they maintain a constant state of war with Israel, and the funding comes from that. So again, it's part of the reason why I think that this watershed scale can actually be more effective, right? You need the watershed scale, but you need diplomatic partners. Because I don't know where you're going to get to with the government of Israel and the leaders of Hamas. I would venture to say, having watched these past decades, not very far at all. But what if that's not the level at which you work? What if you work at, people, look, here's the coastal aquifer. It runs all up and down the coast. And I shared the letter of the Israeli municipalities begging the Israeli government. They're like, we know it's really complicated with Gaza and they drop bombs on us, but having untreated wastewater in the Mediterranean Sea isn't going to do anybody any good. So it's why I almost think like the national scale is not the best one at which to deal with questions of water.
Okay, thank you so much. And by the way, there was somebody in the chat saying that your talk has been fascinating.
Yes, thank you. That was our last question, and as always, excellent discussion. Thank you again, Dr. Havrelock. I do want to make a note. This presentation is recorded and it will be available this Friday on the WACI website, as well as on the UIS ECHE series website for the students to view as part of their course. And before we conclude, I want to thank everyone that is a member of WACI. And just a quick note, if you are interested in joining WACI, there is information on our website. And we also wanted to note our future programs that we have. The next one is in December, on December 3rd. We're going to have Dr. Megan Stiles. She's with right here, University of Illinois, Springfield. And she is going to do a presentation on roses from Kenya, labor, environment, and the global trade in cut flowers. So that's on December 3rd. This concludes our program, but if you will notice, there is a new reaction icon on your Zoom. So to thank Dr. Havrelock for a wonderful evening, a wonderful discussion, if you'd like to send a chat or leave a reaction to let her know how much we appreciated that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel.
Really a pleasure. Thanks for spending this evening with me.
Wonderful. Thank you.